In this episode, we take a careful step into legal and regulatory requirements, not as scary legal language, but as real-world forces that shape what a system is allowed to do and how it must behave. New learners often hear that security is about technology, but a huge portion of security architecture is about constraints, and some of the strongest constraints come from laws, regulations, and oversight expectations. The tricky part is that legal text rarely tells you exactly what to build, and technical teams rarely speak in legal terms, so an architect often acts as a translator. Your job is to turn broad obligations like protect personal data or maintain auditability into specific, enforceable architecture rules that teams can implement and reviewers can verify. When you do this well, you prevent late surprises, reduce compliance risk, and create designs that can survive scrutiny after an incident. This topic also shows up on exams because it tests whether you can connect abstract requirements to practical control choices without getting stuck in tool details. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is understanding what legal and regulatory requirements are trying to accomplish, because the intent helps you interpret the obligation in a way that leads to good design. Many laws focus on protecting individuals, such as privacy and consumer protection, while others focus on protecting markets, critical services, or public trust. Regulations often exist because organizations failed in predictable ways, like mishandling sensitive information, hiding breaches, or failing to maintain records that prove accountability. When you see it through that lens, the requirement is not arbitrary. It is a response to a pattern of harm. That matters because architecture is about preventing predictable failures at scale, and legal requirements often point directly at those failure patterns. If you treat the requirement as a checklist item, you may satisfy the words but miss the risk it was meant to reduce. If you treat it as an intent that must be operationalized, you design controls that actually deliver protection. Next, you need to distinguish between laws, regulations, and organizational obligations, because they can feel similar but they operate differently. A law is a rule created through a formal legislative process, and it often establishes broad rights, duties, and penalties. A regulation is typically created by a regulatory body to operationalize a law, adding detail about what compliance looks like and how enforcement works. Organizations also face obligations through contracts and internal policies, and while those are not laws, they can still be mandatory in practice because violating them can cost business or trigger penalties. From an architecture perspective, you treat all of these as requirement sources, but you also track their authority level and how they will be evaluated. Some requirements are audited formally, others are tested during investigations, and others are enforced through customer demands. Knowing the enforcement path helps you decide how explicit and how measurable your constraints must be. Now we arrive at the translation problem, which is turning legal language into engineering language without losing meaning. Legal requirements are often written in broad terms like reasonable security, appropriate safeguards, or timely notification, which can be hard for technical teams to act on. The architect's move is to convert vague words into specific control objectives and then into concrete design constraints. For example, a vague duty to protect personal information can translate into objectives like limit access, minimize collection, secure storage, ensure secure transmission, and provide transparency and accountability. Each objective can then become constraints such as strong authentication for privileged access, encryption for data at rest and in transit, logging of access to sensitive records, and defined retention and deletion rules. The important point is that you are not inventing new obligations. You are clarifying what the obligation means in system terms. That clarity is what makes the requirement enforceable instead of aspirational. An enforceable architecture constraint has three qualities that make it useful. It is testable, it is traceable, and it is scoped. Testable means someone can check whether the system meets it using evidence, not just opinions. Traceable means you can point back to the requirement source and explain why the constraint exists, so it does not feel arbitrary to engineers or leadership. Scoped means the constraint clearly applies to specific data types, systems, or processes, rather than being a vague command that no one can implement consistently. For beginners, think of a constraint as a rule that can be written down and verified, like access to certain data must be logged and reviewed, or certain records must be retained for a defined period. If a constraint cannot be tested, it will be ignored or debated endlessly. If it cannot be traced, it will be challenged when it becomes inconvenient. If it is not scoped, it will either be over-applied and slow everything down or under-applied and create gaps. A common misconception is that compliance is the same as security, but they overlap without being identical, and architecture must handle both realities. Compliance requirements set a minimum expectation and define how accountability is demonstrated, but good security often goes beyond minimums, especially when threats evolve faster than laws. At the same time, a system can be technically secure in some sense while still failing compliance because it cannot produce evidence, cannot support required reporting, or violates rights like data access or deletion. That is why architecture constraints often include evidence and process requirements, not only technical controls. For example, a requirement may imply that you must be able to show who accessed sensitive data, not just prevent unauthorized access. Another may require that you can prove when data was deleted, not just perform deletion. When you design with both protection and proof in mind, you build systems that can survive audits and investigations, which is often the real-world test of compliance maturity. Another key piece is data classification and data flow understanding, because legal obligations usually attach to specific kinds of data and specific handling activities. If you do not know what data you have, where it moves, and where it rests, you cannot apply the right constraints. Many regulatory requirements implicitly depend on knowing which systems store sensitive data, which services process it, and which parties receive it. Architecture work often includes defining categories like personal data, sensitive personal data, financial records, health records, or confidential business information, even if the exact labels vary by organization. Then you define rules for each category, such as stronger access controls, stronger monitoring, specific retention, or extra approvals for sharing. This is not about labeling everything perfectly, but about creating a usable map so obligations can be applied consistently. When an exam question involves legal requirements, the correct architectural move often includes establishing classification and data flow awareness before selecting controls. Legal and regulatory requirements also create constraints around incident handling, and this area surprises many beginners because it extends beyond pure cybersecurity and into communication and timing. Some rules require organizations to notify affected individuals or authorities within specific time windows after discovering certain incidents. That means architecture cannot ignore detection and investigation capabilities, because you cannot notify responsibly if you cannot determine what happened and what data was affected. This translates into constraints about logging, monitoring, and the ability to reconstruct events, as well as constraints about access to records during an investigation. It can also influence segmentation and containment design, because isolating affected systems quickly may be part of meeting a duty of care. For the exam mindset, recognize that legal obligations often require not only prevention, but also visibility and response readiness. A design that is secure but blind can still fail the requirement. Cross-border data and third-party processing requirements are another area where translation becomes architectural, because they affect where systems can be hosted and who can access them. Some regulations restrict transferring certain data across jurisdictions or require specific protections when data is processed by external parties. In architecture terms, this can become constraints like data residency requirements, region-based segmentation, strict access controls for administrators, and contractual requirements for providers. It can also affect how you design identity and privileged access, because regulators may expect separation of duties and monitoring of administrative actions. For beginners, it helps to think of geography and organizational boundaries as part of the system, not outside it. When data crosses boundaries, obligations may change, and the architecture must either prevent crossing or ensure that crossing is controlled and documented. Exam questions may test whether you notice boundary crossings and choose designs that keep obligations satisfied. Because legal language can be ambiguous, architects often rely on an internal process that turns requirements into a structured set of controls and design rules, rather than trying to interpret each clause ad hoc. This typically involves collaborating with legal, compliance, and risk teams to clarify intent, then mapping requirements to control objectives, and then translating those objectives into technical standards and patterns. The architect's contribution is making sure the outcome is implementable and measurable, not just well-worded. It is also making sure constraints are prioritized, because not all obligations carry the same risk if violated, and not all systems are equally sensitive. A mature approach is to define baseline constraints that apply widely and enhanced constraints that apply to high-impact systems or data. That way you are not over-engineering everything, but you are still protecting what matters most. This balance between enforceability and practicality is central to architecture thinking. The exam often rewards decision traceability, meaning you can explain why a particular architectural choice was made and how it satisfies requirements. Legal and regulatory constraints are powerful drivers in that traceability chain because they provide external justification. If you choose encryption, logging, segregation, or retention, you should be able to connect those choices to obligations without sounding like you are guessing. This is also how you avoid personal preference battles inside organizations, because you can say this is required and here is how we prove we met it. Traceability does not mean drowning everyone in paperwork. It means having a clear thread from obligation to design choice to evidence. When you practice this mindset, you become better at answering scenario questions that ask for the best next step or the most appropriate architectural control. You are not just picking a control, you are selecting a control that fits the obligation and can be enforced. As we close, remember that translating legal and regulatory requirements into architecture constraints is the discipline of turning broad external obligations into specific system rules that teams can implement and auditors can verify. You begin by understanding intent, distinguishing authority sources, and converting vague language into clear control objectives. You then create constraints that are testable, traceable, and scoped, grounded in a real understanding of data types and data flows. You design not only for protection but also for proof, including logging, investigation support, and accountability mechanisms that matter after incidents. You also account for boundaries like third parties and jurisdictions, because obligations often change when data crosses those lines. When you build this translation skill, you reduce surprise, improve governance, and strengthen your ability to answer exam questions that connect law and regulation to real architectural decisions.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.